Welcome back to Heard Tell. All right, folks, it's story time with Dr. Michael Siegel. He's a certified scientist, couple times over. He's a good friend of ours, and he is the most appearances of any guest on Heard Tell because he's right real smart, and he's going to answer questions for us because we're actually going to talk science today, buddy, for a change. What a
Hey,
concept! Talk science with the scientist.
that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and we have to believe all scientists, so we have to believe him. Let's start with an easy one here. Since it's in your background, I was going to ask you about it anyway. James Webb Telescope, I know it's one of your absolute favorite things in the entire universe, literally in this case. There's some talk they found themselves some ice out in deep space. Is that what we're hearing right here?
Yeah, so for those of you who are on the YouTube, you can see the image behind me. Others of you can Google it. They came up with a really beautiful image of a star forming region. So what you see behind me is the orange light is existing stars shining through, and the blue light is where you have new stars being formed, protostars. And what they're doing is using the background stars to see what's in that cloud, and we're finding ices of carbon dioxide and other elements and so forth, stuff that we knew was there, but is nice to confirm in these forming stars. This is one of JWST's primary missions, is to pierce the veil of dust and look into how stars are forming, because when they form, they're shrouded in these cocoons of dust, which keep optical light from leaking out. So we can't, it's very hard to see what's in there. And so JWST is looking through those almost like X-ray vision and going to show us a lot of the details on how stars form.
Yeah, I find this interesting because people talk about, there's some themes in space, space, people that cover space for journalism, they have narratives just like political journalists or lifestyle journalists. One of the narratives of especially the last 15, 20 years is this continuous look for, building blocks of life, water molecules, things like this. For somebody at our level that doesn't understand what a big deal that is, this isn't finding the alien civilization is going to show up with a spacecraft. This is just building blocks, bacteria, things like this that we're looking for in the universe. It sounds like small stuff, but scientifically, these would be ginormous leaps in our understanding, right?
Yeah, and if you want to understand the basic building blocks of life, you have to understand the basic building blocks of stars and the star systems, that the planetary systems that form around them. So the more we learn about those early stages, the more we learn about stars, and that does ultimately feed into what we can expect for planets in our universe.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. All right, something else space related has been going on. I find this really interesting, though. They're talking now with the James Webb stuff. I don't know if this is a fair way to put it, but because you've talked about it on this program many times, is this thing exceeding expectations? Because I know you said, this is going to be the next 2 or 3 generations worth of data everybody's going to do. The stuff we're reading now, and I'm a neophyte on this, so you explain to me, folks seem like this is even exceeding people's expectations, even at this early stage of the data.
I would say that the it has exceeded specs, definitely. What we do is when we design a mission, we set the expectations. I've been involved in this in smaller missions where you put together, they send out a call for proposals, and they say we have maybe 2 launch windows. I mean, JWST is a huge mission, so that was a different thing. But when you're talking about smaller missions, they say we have 2 launch windows. And you put together a profile of a mission. This is what we're going to build. This is what we're going to accomplish. This is the questions we're trying to answer. And they will get maybe 30, 40 of those proposals. Then they'll trim them down to maybe 5 or 6 that get a little bit of money to do further investigation to show that the technology is feasible and they're going to be able to answer these questions. And then they down select to 2. So JDST worked on a different cycle because it was a huge mission, a flagship mission, but it still has the same kind of process where you start out, these are the questions we're hoping to answer. These are the specs the mission is going to meet. These are the kind of data we're going to get. And that's sort of your minimum profile. But it is not unusual for us to exceed those profiles because we want to be conservative. We don't want to put the thing up there and say, well, it's not meeting expectations. So we usually try to set fairly realistic expectations and hope that we exceed them. And in the case of JDOST, it seems to be exceeding those expectations.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel. Okay, this is going to be a science heavy segment because usually we end up talking about culture and politics. This will dip into that just a little bit, but it's something we've talked about a lot. When you were on the program, you were kind of one of our go to guys during COVID and that sort of thing. We talked about this a lot. There was a definitive, whatever you thought of everything else, there was definitively a communication problem between the scientific community and the general public. I think there's just no arguing that there's a communication problem there. They don't communicate well. So interesting thing out of UK, I'm going to link to this, talks about the pitfalls of it. And this seems like just common sense, but scientists, they got to go study it and come back and then present common sense as something new to find out, right? People that have more belief in science actually tend to be a little bit more humble about what they don't know. People who don't believe in science tend to be a little more standoffish and know-it-all-ish. How do we start working on the communication barrier between the general public and scientists, whether it's academic or government or whatever? Obviously, they don't speak the same language. Obviously, there's a knowledge gap because you have somebody that's been in the field 20, 30 years and just somebody that's Googling it. They've got, just a barrier there. But as we found out during COVID and we found out during other crises, those two groups of people have to communicate to each other. And when they don't, bad stuff happens, including during a virus, people die. What do we start doing to make this a little bit better?
I think it's more of a cultural change that you're looking for, that people value certainty. If you present what you're saying with certainty, even if you're wrong, people tend to trust you. This is a problem. One of the things I kind of read about a lot is forensic science. And there's been a crisis in forensic science where many of the techniques that people were using to convict people are now turning out not to be very reliable. But when those scientists go to a jury and say, I absolutely know that this is the pliers that cut that wire, that sounds better than someone who said, within a reasonable degree of certainty, it's consistent with this and so forth. So I think it's a cultural change of realizing that uncertainty and caveats are not the language of ignorance or weakness. They are the language of investigation. They are the language of figuring things out. That we have to have a better way of expressing that this is what we know to the best of our knowledge. And that is always subject to change. I mean, there are some things that we're really certain of. There are other things that we're mostly certain of, and there are some things that are still in question. I think with the COVID example, we early on, we thought that this spread through what are called fomites, little things that contaminated surfaces and so forth, and that you could catch it from that. We told everyone to wash their hands and so forth. And it was reasonable advice based on what we knew at the time. But now we don't think that's a way that COVID spreads very well. It's mostly airborne. And so I think that having that, communicating to the public that this is what we think we know now based on this evidence. And if that is updated, if our knowledge changes, we will let you know and why our information is changing, that we have that honesty and communication of bringing people, you're almost like bringing people into the process of science, of saying, here, this is what it's like. This is the uncertainties. This is what we know. This is what we're figuring out, and having them understand that this is a process, not a series of answers.
At Parker, our purpose is simple. We want to make the world a better place by working more efficiently, by using more sustainable practices, by developing better technologies. We keep moving forward. With each new idea, innovation, and partnership, we're one step closer to fulfilling our purpose every single day. To find out more, visit parker.com/purpose. Parker, engineering your success.
These days, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries, and with that, we sent away good jobs and our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make all kinds of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs in towns and cities across the country. And jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
Yeah, Michael Siegel joining us. We're talking science with him, as we often do. Okay, this one's kind of related. This comes out of USC, an institution of some note for various reasons. They're talking about, and we'll link to this piece as well, they're talking about science is political because people are political. Now, that sounds like another common sense statement, but there is this thing. We find this in academics. We find this in education. We find this in religion, other things. You can't just slap something like science on something and automatically make it this magical thing that's completely unbiased. Do we lose focus sometimes? I think we did this during COVID a lot of, oh, the science. Well, no, science is people. Those are people doing it. Is that one of those perspectives we need to keep when we're dealing with things like science and scientists, especially when it comes to things like new studies or new drugs or new discoveries? These are people, and the people factor has to be factored in here somewhere, doesn't it?
And one of the things I like to say is that when you cross science with politics, the result is not to scientize the politics, it's to politicize the science. And it's very difficult to keep that out. And I try to, when I've talked about COVID and so forth, state my biases up front. But one of the things, and Dr. Fauci talked about this, was science often informs debates, but many of these debates over science extend beyond that into things like morality and balancing things like when you're talking about the COVID response, balancing the economy and education and trying to keep people from dying and so forth. So I think there's a tendency to think that one perspective, because it has a favorite alliance with certain science, is better than any other, but you have to remember that there are always other factors that are at play.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. Look, people spend a lifetime studying this kind of stuff. Where does science stop? Where does morality stop? Where does scientific belief and religious belief or metaphysics or whatever you want to call it? People spend whole lifetimes trying to figure that stuff out. What's just kind of like a guide rule when you start getting it? Something's like, okay, well, here's the science, and then here's where the morality starts. For just a lay person, that line's always going to be gray, and it's going to have a spectrum to it. But what's just kind of a guideline you've always tried to adhere to? Or when you're teaching like first-year students or somebody like that that's just introducing into these science stuff, like, hey, yeah, morality and science are not the same thing, but here's where they start to overlap, and just realize this is where the overlapping is starting to happen.
There's a quote I use, I think I've used it on your show as well, from one of the Indiana Jones movies, where he says, archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, the philosophy class is just down the hall. You have to focus on where are you talking about facts and where are you talking about judgment. We've talked about this in politics before, that you take one of the most contentious debates in our society, abortion. Science can tell you where certain milestones are reached for fetal development. Science can tell you what the risk profile is for pregnant women and so forth. But ultimately, you're talking about a moral judgment of when does the fetus have a right to live? When does the woman have a right to control her body? That is a moral judgment. So the further you get away from fact, the more you're getting into other things like philosophy and religion and politics, and the further you are from getting into science. And there are some debates where science doesn't have answers. I mean, the abortion debate, like I said, is a perfect example where you're talking about moral questions, and you can't have science say this is more moral than the other thing. People say science is amoral. I don't quite think that's the case, but it has a moral limitations.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. Okay, here's a popular one. A couple people were asking about this one, so we'll ask you about it. This is almost a pet peeve of mine, but the studies say. So we see all these news stories of the studies say, and they never link to the story, and they never link to the study, and then we can't read the studies. Look, studies are like a lot of things. There's good ones, there's bad ones, there's paid for ones, there's people honestly trying to overcome truth. Give folks from the science perspective as a certified scientist how to weed through when it's just the studies say, because that's become kind of a crutch for news reports. They just say the study says, but that doesn't really tell us anything about the study, let alone anything else, does it?
No, when you're online, I will ignore any resource that doesn't link to the actual study, because 9 times out of 10, when I find the study, they're misquoting it or misrepresenting it. Things to watch out for are, did they talk to the scientists who actually did the study to confirm that? I've had experience with science journalists, I mean, not on anything contentious, but on things like astronomy, and the good ones call you, they confirm it, they send you the story to say, is this right, what I said here, and so forth. If they're quoting the scientists, that's usually a good sign. Another sign, and this is more in the political arena than the journalistic arena, if someone says all of the studies say, you can bet your bottom dollar that all the studies do not say that. Maybe most of the studies say, maybe the consensus of the studies say that, but you always get outlier studies. If you flip a coin 20 times, odds are you'll get 10 heads and 10 tails, but that's not going to happen every time. Maybe you get 15 heads just because of the luck. Same thing is true of studies. When you study things, sometimes you get bad results. And it's not because you did anything wrong. It's not because you're fraudulent. It's just because you got a bad set of data. It just happens. And so many of these issues we try to study over and over again. One of the things to look for are what they call meta studies, where they take a whole bunch of studies of an issue and put them together and try to get a consensus sense of what they're looking at. We talked last year about the science on gun control, and the RAND Corporation did this meta study where they took hundreds of studies and they narrowed it down to the ones that were the highest quality and said, okay, when we combine these, what do they say? You can always find a study that will support whatever point you want to make. But when you look at the consensus of studies, when you look at multiple studies, that's when the truth comes out. And especially when you're talking about kind of contentious issues, a lot of times it's difficult to get the truth, that you're looking at a very small signal in a very large population. And so the more studies you have, the more data you have, the more certain you are of your conclusions.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. Part of that is, this is just where you got to have a little bit of a grown folk talk. Again, science isn't like, it's like education, like religion, whatever. Just slapping science on it doesn't make it science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Research has money involved. Research has big money involved in it. There's jobs on the line. There's futures on the line. There's careers. There's reputations. Is it not fair to ask where these studies come from, who's funding them, who's behind them, where did they come from? Just like we would try out a product. We would check a political figure, where's his funding come from? Who's backing him? There should be some room for some healthy skepticism of science and the scientific process, because, and you've said this on this show many, many times, science is a lot of other things. The more transparent it is, the more you're probably getting a better product from that scientist or the scientific study, right?
Yep, and most journals now require disclosure of funding sources. When I publish a paper, I'm just saying it was funded by the NSF and NASA, but with health studies and so forth, you do have to disclose that. There was a very big controversy early on in the pandemic where a study claimed that COVID was way less lethal than anyone was saying, and we could open up, everyone had herd immunity and so forth. And the study turned out to be badly flawed, but there was a controversy because they did not disclose that they had gotten some funding from the founder of JetBlue, who definitely wanted things to reopen. And that's not necessarily meaning they did bad science. Maybe that funding didn't affect their results at all, but you have to disclose so people can take that into consideration when they consider what your results are.
Yeah, Michael Siegel. Okay, science sometimes brings out nefarious things. Let's just be fair about that, especially technology things. You are at an institution of higher learning, so this is a good thing for you to ask. the AI driven stuff, the chat GT, all this sort of things where AI can, and it's still wonky enough that somebody like you and me who actually write semi-professionally, at least, on a higher level of being published, we could still look at that and say that, okay, something's off. This is wonky, but it's getting close, and it's probably going to get closer in the future. You're at an institution of higher learning. I got to think this is a topic of discussion of what we're going to do about this. This has a lot of ramifications. You just said it. Study says you can get a study to say anything. Well, if we can pop out 40 studies a week through AI, now we're going to have a flood problem of bad information. I got to think this is a topic of discussion in the scientific community. You're on that side of the fence. Is it a topic, and what are people proposing to do about it?
I don't think it's so much of a topic for scientific publications because you only have so much data to go around. So popping that out is not going to help you so much. It is a big concern right now in education circles where people are going to be able to get basically AI generated essays and term papers that will be indistinguishable from what was written by a human. And how do you fight that? I've jokingly suggested we're going to have to go back to oral exams for everything, but it's tricky. In education, what I usually do is I give my tests at a testing center where they have computers that aren't on the internet and they have to secure their phones and so forth, and that sort of thing. I mean, but ultimately, this is a battle that we're going to have to fight in higher ed to basically keep people from letting the computers do their learning for them.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. This is a little bit more of a meta question, but I wanted to ask you about it because we're starting to hear some of this. Again, this is look, COVID changed a lot of things in the scientific community because a lot of people paid attention to science for the first time in a long time, right? That's good, bad, and different, but that sunlight revealed darkness and shadow both, right? Science is always going to be academic heavy. It's always going to lean towards government research because that's where the money is. There's just, paths in science just like any other career field. There does seem to be a discussion, and there does seem to be some growing movement that we've really lost some community-based science, and that there's more local level, maybe state level, maybe, major city level stuff that could be done scientifically. And just like media, just like education, like a lot of things, there's been this nationalization and we're losing some community science. Is that a legitimate concern? Because it makes a lot of sense of like, look, there's just some communities that need some scientific research in those communities that's more organic. This, again, would probably come through the academic field. But just what are your thoughts on that?
That's a tricky one. Most of the funding has to come from the federal government because you are often talking about big projects that are hard to fund. But there are a lot of little grants and little programs that are run at the state level, at the university level, and at the private level that can help fund students and so forth. And there's been particular emphasis recently on putting money towards women and underrepresented minorities being able to do science with grants and funding for graduate students that's available specifically to advance those communities. So I think that we are moving more towards something that's community oriented, but it's always going to be tricky because when you're talking about like JWST, you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar mission. That's something that can only be funded at the federal level.
All right, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. All right, here's another question that somebody had, and I think this is actually a really good one. For the last, I don't know, probably last 10, 15, 20 years or so, STEM's been a big push for secondary education going into college. We need to get more kids in the STEM. We need to get more elementary programs in the STEM. We need to have a STEM pipeline into universities. We see the numbers out of other countries, especially places like China, which, look, numerically, we're just not going to be able to compete with them. They can pump out 1,000 scientists every one of ours. But there's been this big push for STEM. Has that gotten a little too buzzwordy, and should we maybe retool our branding on how we're trying to get folks into the sciences, however you want to say that? STEM's a good acronym. I'm not knocking it individually, but we just used it for so much. Maybe it's kind of losing maybe losing the buzz on it a little bit. Do we need to kind of rebrand? Look, the military changes its recruiting every so often. Schools change their logos. The NFL changes logos 6 times a season. Does science need a new branding other than just we need more STEM students, do you think?
I don't think so. I'd actually disagree a little bit there because it's becoming just, I've watched with my own kids, it's becoming part of their background that they just expect science and engineering education to be part of the warp and weft of education. And I see it in undergrads that they have a science requirement and they're not fighting it or trying to look for easy classes as much as they did when I was in college. I mean, I've taught the Astro 101 class, and it's a more intense class than we had when I was a college student. And most of them are not science majors, and they do really well in it. There's a huge interest in this sort of thing, and I think it sparks the imagination, even for people who don't go into scientific fields. I think having that exposure to the wider universe, having the exposure, especially if you're emphasizing how science works and the process of science, and these aren't just edicts handed down by guys in white jackets, that these are things that we work on, things that we is a process. In my class, and I know in other classes, they'll emphasize ideas that we thought were right that were wrong, and why we figured out they were wrong, and how we replaced them with better ideas. So I think overall, this is one of those things that I think is generally good. Obviously, there's always work you can do to improve it, and I think especially disadvantaged communities, to extending the reach out there so that they have more exposure to this. But I think overall, making the public even just a little bit more scientifically literate is going to pay off ultimately.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel joining us. It's you said something there that I don't want to just skip over because I think it's really important. When you teach that introductory class, Astronomy 101 or whatever it's called, those introductory classes, like you said, not everybody in that class is going to become an astronomer, but it'll pique an interest. I know, like when I took English 101 the first time, I didn't realize how good my high school English teacher had been until I took that class, and I turned in my first essay, and the guy's like, "Who was your English teacher?" I'm like, "Mrs. Nash." And he's like, "Oh, you don't need to take this class. You've already had it." You know, there's a realization when you take those entry level classes. This is more for your educator hat than your scientist hat. Those 101 classes, those introductory English, introductory humanities, usually an introductory science, either an astronomy or a natural science or whatever, psychology 101. There's an inherent educational and scientific value to taking a general education course like that, because it does open you up to other things. That plays into something, I've told my own children, I tell people, like, nobody cares where you take English 101 at. Go to community college. Nobody cares, right? That's something that I think we don't tell people coming up out of high school enough, is like, yes, take those courses, because it may not be a career thing, but it'll definitely be a perception changing thing. And you've seen that firsthand because you teach that class.
Yep. And I think that's one of the things where America is better than a lot of the rest of the world, because in many countries, they focus their undergraduate education much more narrowly on what their specialty is. I have people come to here from other countries, and they're like, "Why are your science students taking English classes and taking the anthropology classes and so forth?" And then, they write a lot better than students who haven't taken those classes. It broadens the perspective. It teaches you skills that are applicable in many areas. If you're taking an intro science class or an intro chemistry class and you're going to be a lawyer, you're not going to learn anything that you're going to use in a courtroom probably, but you are learning to broaden your perspective, to get a little bit of insight. And if you end up with where you have a scientific question in law, you have more of that feeling of how to go about asking the right questions, how to filter the right answers, and so forth. I'm a very big believer in a broad education, and that people should do the humanities, they should do the social sciences, they should do science, because I think that these cross-pollinate into making you better at whatever you choose to do. Having that education from other fields, I think, broadens your mind, gives you that perspective, gives you those skills that can be applied.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Siegel, talking a little science. All right, time for a fun question here. I almost am embarrassed to even ask you this, but I'm going to anyway because it's fun. I got to ask you about this. So this was online. I'm going to ask you about this. British. Now it's our British friends. I'm not going to make a British food joke here because I think British food's actually pretty good. And I will link to the picture. Plant-based mashed potatoes. Now, scientifically, when we're labeling things plant-based mashed potatoes, I feel like maybe we've crossed from science into marketing just a smidge bit. But you, doctor, scientist, tell me what you think.
That sounds like marketing to me. Like someone saw plant-based meat and was wanted to reassure people that potatoes are not meat or something like that. I agree with you on British food, by the way. Half of my mission is in the UK, so I've been there a few times. And if you, I could eat fish and chips all day, and there are wonderful curry shops. And if you go to like a small pub in the middle of nowhere in England, you're probably going to have a really good meal.
I tell people all the time, I was like, it gets unfairly bashed because they're always comparing it to like French food and hot cuisine or whatever. That's hot, not hot, for those of you from Logan. If you think of it as comfort food going in, it hits much closer. You know what I'm saying? But I've ate very, very well when I've been in the UK. I have no complaints whatsoever. Michael Siegel, who's married to an Aussie who likes Outback, but that's another story for another day.
Australia Day coming up, where we'll have to go there. We always go to Australia Day.
Is that? I would think that would be an offensive thing, but you're actually just embracing it. Is that what you're telling me?
My wife just likes the food there, so and the sort of Aussie kitsch she kind of finds more amusing than offensive. I've had the reverse of that. I was in Brisbane, and I went to an American restaurant, and it was like the waitresses were all in cowboy hats, and it was all steak and so forth. And I was like, oh, so this must be what's like when people come to America and go to our restaurants. But it was good. The food was good, and it was a good place, so I didn't mind.
Yeah, I will cop to going to TGI Fridays just off Trafalgar Square in London, but that's another story for another day. Our good friend Dr. Michael Siegel, he flies spaceships, he writes, he has a wonderful YouTube channel where he has all kinds of sci-fi science mashup explainers, including one that involved me, but that almost killed his ratings. Let folks know where they can follow you, where they can keep up with you, and where they can find you until we get you back on Heard Tell again, my friend.
If you go to www.ordinary-times.com, that's where I do all my writing. I post my YouTube videos there. There'll be links to my Twitter, and one-stop shopping. And even if you don't see me, you'll almost certainly see a really good writer there.
Yeah, we're pretty proud of it. Dr. Michael Siegel, great knowledge, great insight. Always enjoy chatting with you and appreciate you bringing it down to the level where even I can understand it. Thank you, sir.
It's always a pleasure to be on, Andrew.
Thank you.
Now let me see you go off like a bomb.
Religion is at the intersection of our 21st century life, even if we don't express a faith. At a time when it seems that religion isn't as prevalent as it once was, it still leaves its mark everywhere. As a pastor, I know that religion isn't something I just do on a Sunday, but it's found in every nook and cranny of my life. Sexuality, politics, social media, the economy, war, nationalism, all have some kind of religious angle to them. And as a communicator, I want to find the stories that can help people understand this part of our society that is so important to so many. Hi, I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm the host of Church and Main. Church and Main is a podcast about the journey of faith and where it intersects with modern life. I look at faith with a journalist's eye, asking the who, where, what, why, and how religion affects some of the major issues of the day. Join me as we journey together. You can listen to Church in Main podcast at the website churchandmain.org or on your favorite podcast app. I look forward to seeing you.
Folks, you've heard of Ethan Brown on the Heard Tell show a couple of different times, but if you're interested in learning about how to discuss things like climate change without all the politics and doom and gloom, head over to his podcast, The Sweaty Penguin. Sweaty Penguin is a late-night comedy-style climate podcast working to add nuance, critical thinking, humor, and hope to the climate conversation. They got over 100 episodes already, breaking down weekly news stories and specific topics, from the vanilla to the ADHD to the international accountability to orangutans. Yes, I know, it's a comedy thing, so just go with it. But each time, exploring different ways we can make progress on these issues while still helping the economy, health, security, and everything else we care about. Feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or excluded by today's climate change discourse? This is the podcast for you. Find the Sweaty Penguin wherever you get your podcasts or at www.thesweatypenguin.com.